This is Shaping Opinion, a production of O'Brien Communications. What is your earliest memory of Hershey as far as the candy, the first candy that you ate?
Probably was pretty late. We did not have candy in the house as a rule. My mom was always on a diet, so it just wasn't present. So probably when I got to high school and there was a 5 and dime store at the bottom of the hill from our high school, and I can remember walking in there, and at that point, Hershey bars were right on the cusp of changing from a nickel to 10 cents, but it was something that was very affordable. And I can remember going in and buying a Hershey's milk chocolate with almonds bar.
I'm Tim O'Brien. In this episode of the Shaping Opinion podcast, we're joined by Pamela Whitenack. Pamela was the director of the Hershey Community Archives until her recent retirement. The premise of our podcast is simple. We talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Today we're going to talk with Pamela about the history of Hershey, the man, the company, and that iconic chocolate bar. If I were to say the word Hershey's, most likely the first thing you would picture is that iconic American chocolate bar. But there's a story behind that candy bar, and it all starts with one man who never allowed his failures to have the last word. In the end, he would succeed at the highest levels of business, live a long life, and leave a community legacy that continues to this day. Today we'll be talking about Milton Hershey and the Hershey story. Pamela, you were the director of Hershey Community Archives for decades. Can you tell us what that job entailed and what drew you to that job?
Serendipity. I had attended the University of Delaware for my master's degree in American history, but I also, towards the end of my academic experience there, was looking for work or starting to think about what I might do. And the director of the Hagley Library, which is a prominent business and economic history archives in Wilmington, Delaware, was teaching a class on archival management. So I figured, well, this seems practical and I needed a course, and so I took it, and it turned out to be something that really appealed to me. But right after I finished graduate school, I had my first child, and we moved to Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And about 18 months later, my boss, the man that would become my boss, Richmond Williams, he was the director of the Hagley Library, called me and said, I'm helping to start an archives in Hershey. Would you be interested in some work? And I was like, oh, that sounds interesting. And so it was because I had taken this graduate class, and the man that turned out to be my mentor was looking for someone in the area and knew me, that I stumbled upon this job.
What was the job? Since he was just starting it when you started it with him, what was his goal?
Well, the archives that was being created was established as a cooperative venture between Milton Hershey's corporations and the M.S. Hershey Foundation. And they sort of debated over the name of the organization, but they really settled on, it was very deliberate on their part, to call it the Hershey Community Archives, to really recognize that Milton Hershey not only established a number of businesses, but he also established a community as well. And so the first goal was to pull what could be archival materials that had sort of just been stored in nooks and crannies all over town, and to start doing an inventory, start getting them organized. And that's what I was hired to do.
Well, you were brought here way back then to start to basically chronicle the history of Hershey. And we all know that it started with one person, his name, Milton Hershey. But his story really starts in his childhood. Everything that I read about Milton Hershey, you can't talk about the history of Hershey without actually talking about Milton Hershey in his own childhood. Can you describe what kind of childhood he had?
Milton Hershey was born in this area, probably about a mile from where we are right now. on his grandfather's farm in a farmhouse that came to be known as the homestead. And his parents both were raised in prosperous Mennonite families, and his father was the eldest of his siblings. And his father was someone who loved books, loved knowledge, really wanted to pursue that. But his father had, the very strong expectation that his father Henry would follow in the footsteps of the family and become a farmer. And as a result, Henry would spend a lifetime trying to basically serve two masters. Could never let go of the desire to learn and experiment, but also felt the guilt and of not succeeding as a farmer because he just didn't have his heart in it. As a result, Milton Hershey had a pretty chaotic childhood. His parents moved frequently, often just ahead of the bill collector, sometimes moving for that, sometimes because his father was pursuing another dream. His mom got tired of it, and particularly after Milton's sister, Serena, died just before her 5th birthday from scarlet fever. I think that was really the breaking point for the family. And his parents separated at that time. And Milton grew up in a single-parent household and lived in a pretty impoverished family unit.
There's something interesting about the topics that we sometimes pick for this podcast, and that is the intersection between the personalities that we talk about and history. And in this case, I wanted to find out from you if this is true or not, but one of the stories that I had heard about Milton Hershey was he was born in 1857, so that was right before the Civil War. And when he was about 6 years old, I had heard that he, like everybody, heard that the Confederate Army had invaded Pennsylvania, and one of I don't know if this is lore or not, that he buried some of his coins so that Robert E. Lee and the Confederates wouldn't take it away. But the point of that story, as it was told to me, was that from a very early age, he learned sort of the value of money and the importance of saving it, and maybe the importance to go out and earn it and make money. Is there any truth to that story?
It is true that I've heard from several accounts that during the Battle of Gettysburg, some of the cannon fire could be heard, even though we're, 60 miles from Gettysburg. But and people were very concerned in this region. Were very concerned that Lee and his army were going to push forth and pass through what's Derry Township, and so people were burying their valuables. And so that was Milton Hershey's spur. He had some valuables. He was going to bury it also. All the other things that are attributed to that, I think it's nice to, you see his life and how it unfolds. Whether he's thinking about that as a 6-year-old, I don't have any documentation for that.
Well, you wouldn't, and those stories always tend to be embellished over time.
They
those
have
types
grown,
of stories.
definitely, yes.
But 6 years old for us is very young, but he went to work at a very young age. How young was he when he started to actually work outside the home?
As a member of a farming family, farming children start working at a very early age. You are, collecting the eggs or you're feeding the animals. And so that is nothing new. He actually, when in various locations, they were living in southern Lancaster County for a while when he was still a youth. And he was being paid, though he wasn't seeing any of the money, to escort a younger child, between her home and where the schoolhouse was. So, when he's 10, 11 years old, he's starting to generate some income for the family. But it's when he is between 13 and 14 that he leaves sort of his academic schooling and becomes apprentice. And so that's though he's not earning any money, he's starting to learn a trade at that point.
And it wasn't too long before he actually started on his career. I know that one of the big stories about him was that he didn't have a formal education into a late age, and he never was one of those people who who wrote a lot of articles or journals or didn't pride himself on his own literary abilities, but he did have a great value for education for the rest of his life. But he did value a work ethic, and he lived that. And from what I had read was that when he was 18 years old, he opened his own candy shop in Philadelphia, and that was sort of when his career started to happen. I don't want to say take off because there were a series of failures after that. Can you explain his career arc from the time he was 18 and he opened that candy shop?
So he has a 4-year apprenticeship with a candy maker in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, a man by the name of Joseph Royer, who had a successful candy business in Soda Fountain in downtown Lancaster. But Milton Hershey, one of his great characteristics is that he has this entrepreneurial spirit, and it's very apparent when you look at his entire life. So having that, he finishes a 4-year apprenticeship. It's just before he's going to turn 19 years old. And he goes to Philadelphia. Philadelphia is attractive. It's the year of the nation's centennial. So there's the centennial celebrations taking place in Philadelphia. So there are a lot of people coming to Philadelphia. And I think he wanted to, sort of get away and strike out on his own. So he opens a candy shop in the spring of 1876 on Spring Garden Street in Philadelphia. And candy shops in those days were something you would have just an amazing variety of candy. There would be jellies and taffies and creams and not really chocolate, but all sorts of other things, what we would call, gummy bear kind of candies and things like that, but a wide range, plus nuts. Plus he also is dabbling in ice cream and cakes as well. And he's making a living. Business, if you track that business, it's expanding a little bit. He takes on additional property. He is venturing into the wholesale trade as well as the retail trade. And then his father pops back into the picture. And his father has one of his great brainstorms, and but he's motivated by the fact that he wants to help his son succeed. And he has this vision for a new business that will help Milton Hershey's candy business. And he has designed this candy display cabinet. And it has a false front. There's one on exhibit in the Hershey Story Museum. And the false front makes it look like the candy drawers are always full. But then behind that, there are drawers that you can fill. And the vision is that you will sell this candy display cabinet to customers in Philadelphia or maybe other places. And then you'll develop that wholesale trade. So they'll keep on coming back to fill up their candy display cabinets. Unfortunately, I think only 7, maybe 8 cabinets are ever known to have been built. And, the business just flops. But Milton Hershey's had to invest in the development of this candy display cabinet. And so he takes his cash to pay off that part of the business. When he takes that cash and diverts it to this new business, he doesn't have the money that he needs to maintain his existing business. And it's a slow slide, but within 2 years, his Philadelphia candy business has just crashed.
And then after that, he goes to Denver. That's when he's introduced to caramel manufacturing. What does he learn in Denver that he then takes back to Pennsylvania?
Well, caramels are really popular, common kind of confection in the late 19th century. So Milton Hershey would have had caramels in his Philadelphia candy business. But when he goes to Denver, he goes there because his father, has bounced out of Philadelphia before Milton Hershey really crashes. And he's gone off to seek, greener pastures. And he's headed out to Denver, and he writes letters back to his son saying, this is, there's a lot of opportunity here. You should come here. I think, you could make your fortune here. Unfortunately, Milton Hershey's timing is not great, and the silver boom has just gone bust, and so Denver is entering into an economic depression about the same time Milton Hershey's arriving there. And he sees that there's not really an opportunity to start a new business there, and he needs to make a make some money, and so he finds work working for another confectioner. And it's this confectioner that has a recipe for making caramels using fresh milk, which is not a typical recipe. And what using fresh milk does is that it makes the caramels naturally chewy. If you look at recipes for caramels in the late 19th century, it's not uncommon to see the paraffin listed as an ingredient because the wax would make it chewy. But milk eliminated the need to add paraffin and made them naturally chewy. It also had the advantage of making caramels have a much longer shelf life. So these were really great characteristics for a candy product. And Milton Hershey just works there for a few months, and then he heads off to New York City because back in his brain, his father is telling him, if you're going to do something, do it in a big way. And so New York is the biggest city in the United States, so he heads to New York.
So he goes from Philadelphia to Denver to New York, and every time things don't work out perfectly for him, or at least the way he had hoped. But it seems like each time he learns something really important that builds on the success he'll eventually have. What was his attitude throughout this whole process? Did he ever look at any of these things as a failure, or did he just decide to keep moving?
I think Milton Hershey, and this is reflected later in his life, but Milton Hershey is someone who saw failure as a learning opportunity. It wasn't really a setback. It was an opportunity to learn something and to benefit from it. And he always believed in himself. So he goes to New York, again, starts his business. This time he doesn't have any kind of retail presence. He's just doing wholesale. And this business, we know very little bit about it and it's only in existence for a little over 2 years. But it seems to be growing. He needs, actually what is his downfall is the fact that he needs to expand. He has a small manufacturing space, and then his business is growing, so he needs a larger manufacturing space. He unfortunately has not really mastered the rules about real estate and fails to get out of his first lease before he takes on a second. And it's the weight of trying to carry 2 leases that causes the business to crash and burn.
This is one of the things that I found interesting because at that time in his life, he eventually comes back then to Lancaster and he starts his own caramel manufacturing company. How did he do that? Where did he get the money to even start something like that?
I think when Milton Hershey has to leave New York and he returns to Lancaster because that's where his family is living, his mother's family in particular. And he is now 29 years old. And I think a lot of pieces have come together for him. And he has realized that he should just focus on caramels. He should focus on doing a wholesale trade rather than any kind of retail business. And he feels that with this formula for caramels that he learned from the candy maker in Denver, he's got a product with a great potential for success. So he comes back, and over the years, particularly when he was in Philadelphia, his mother's family, his mother's brothers have been helping him, advancing him money from time to time. But by the time he comes back from New York, his uncles have decided that he's, just doesn't have a future. He's too much like his father. It's just going to be throwing good money after bad. And so they basically just turned their back on him. And one of the stories is that they wouldn't even permit him to spend the night at the Snavely farm. So he turns around and, stays with a friend in Lancaster City. But that self-confidence that he has, doesn't defeat him. He's just like, well, it may be a little bit harder, but I think I can do this and I'm going to move forward. And so he begins making caramels. He's rented a small space in a large warehouse, and he's peddling his caramels. And by chance, and we know so little bit about this story, but he has an interaction with a British importer who tries his caramels, is very impressed with them, and places a very large order to be shipped to Britain. And in order to do this, Milton Hershey's going to need to buy raw ingredients. He's going to need to buy additional equipment. And he goes around to all the banks, and everyone is like, really? You must be joking. But he convinces one of the bankers, a man by the name of Joseph Brenneman, by his Milton Hershey himself. Mr. Brenneman is impressed by Milton Hershey. And so he decides to take a risk. Not so much, and to eliminate questions from the bank, Mr. Brenneman co-signs the loan for Milton Hershey. So Milton Hershey gets the money, buys the equipment, buys the ingredients, fulfills the order, and the British importer, pays for the shipment. And, after 10 years of hard work, Milton Hershey all of a sudden is on the road to success.
And it is a road. He started that road when he was 28 years old, when he moved back. So he was, after all of the experience he had, he was still a young person who started a manufacturing operation. And as he was running this very successful now caramel manufacturing company, he decides in 1893 to attend the Chicago International Exposition. And that's when everything changed.
One of the things I think you need to know first about caramels is that we tend to think of caramels as a very small niche product. And there's only a couple different kinds of caramels. When Milton Hershey was manufacturing caramels, he had well over 100 different items in his product line. Caramels came in all shapes and sizes, flavors. There were chocolate-flavored and chocolate-coated caramels, and they were some of his best sellers. But there were peach-flavored caramels, and it was remarkable, the number of caramels that there were. Anyway, his business, the Lancaster Caramel Company, has grown by the early 1890s, has grown to be the dominant caramel manufacturer in the United States. He's shipping internationally as well as nationally. And because of that, he needs to build a caramel manufacturing facility in Chicago to address reducing his shipping to the West Coast and to the West. And so he does that. 1892, that factory opens, and that puts him in position to be in Chicago in 1893 and attend the Columbian World's Exposition. While there, he will see a few things that play a role in his future life, but from a business perspective, he sees an exhibit of chocolate manufacturing equipment, and he's intrigued. Milton Hershey loves new and innovation. I think really always loved gadgets and machinery. And because his chocolate-flavored and chocolate-coated caramels are so successful in his product line, he begins to think, well, why not, diversify and start making my own chocolate? And so with that in mind, and in fact, he turns to the person that he's visiting the exhibition with. He was the manager of the Lancaster Caramel Company Chicago branch. And he turns to him and says, caramels are a fad. Chocolate is permanent. I'm going to make chocolate. And Milton Hershey, once he makes up his mind, he likes to move very quickly. So the exhibition closes in October. He arranges to purchase 2 pieces of equipment that were on exhibit. In January, we have a letter in the archives that outlines all the other machinery that he's buying from the company, and he sets it up all in a wing of the Lancaster Caramel factory in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And then he has to start figuring out, well, how do you make chocolate?
So when did he figure out how to use that equipment, and what did he do first?
Well, actually, one of the first things he does is incorporate the Lancaster Caramel Company. And within that is the origins of the Hershey Chocolate Company in those incorporation papers. And so this year, the Hershey Company is celebrating 125 years. February 8th, 1894 was the date that incorporation was approved. So he quickly figures out how to make what we would call either dark or semi-sweet chocolate. And at first he uses it for his own caramel products, but within a year he's beginning to manufacture what are known as sweet chocolate novelties. And they follow a pattern very similar to the caramels, except that these have actual packaging. So well over 100 different items in the product line, all different price points and shapes and sizes. The packaging, much of the packaging is just beautiful, very colorful. The higher end products the labels are embossed, but it's all pieces of chocolate. They're not really bars. But somewhere along the line, so that's 1895, somewhere in the next few years, he's going to begin to think about, well, I make my caramels with fresh milk. Perhaps I could figure out how to make milk chocolate using fresh milk. At that point in the late 19th century, milk chocolate is a luxury item. It's only made by the Swiss, and it's something that's very expensive. It's not within the reach of the average person. And Milton Hershey never wrote anything down, so we do a lot of conjecture and, what happened, and we try to look back and see how the pieces might fit together. And so a lot of this is just our best guess. We know what happened, but we can't say definitively, well, this is what Milton Hershey was thinking, because he never wrote it down.
When did he come up with a Hershey bar?
So the Hershey milk chocolate bar was introduced in 1900. Coincidentally, it's the same year that the Lancaster Caramel Company is sold. He made $1 million. They were not a simultaneous thing. Actually, the two other major manufacturers of caramel had approached him in 1898, first about merging with them so that they would dominate the market. And Milton Hershey wasn't interested in that because he had already decided that caramels were a fad. But then they came back and said, well, could we purchase the Lancaster Caramel Company? And he was agreeable to that. And so that decision is made in early 1899, but it'll take them over a year to negotiate the sales price and come to a conclusion with that. So it's just sort of this happy coincidence that he's divesting himself of something that he's lost interest in and giving him the money to really focus on something that he thinks is the future.
He had so much success at that time, $1 million in 1900. What would that have been by today's economics?
I've done the calculations, but it depends on what formula you use. But we're talking, close to $1 billion.
So he's in by those days' standards, he's almost what we would consider a billionaire today, a young billionaire. And he hasn't even launched the product that he's most known for. The question I have is, to get to that point, how would you describe him as a marketer?
Milton Hershey believed that the product would sell itself. One of his catchphrases was, give them quality, it's the best advertising. And so because of that, he didn't invest a whole lot in any kind of consumer advertising. He's very fortunate in that he is making choices and introducing a product at almost the perfect time. And so it's a new product, it's a luxury item all of a sudden made available to the average person. It's affordable, it costs 5 cents. And he's just at this incredible convergence of the emergence of national brands. You think about Heinz or you think about Campbell, all coming, really into fruition in the late 19th century. And that whole concept of brand identity, that you don't need to see the product, you know that the quality of the product just based on that brand name. And so he's the leader in the confectionery world, and his timing is perfect. It's amazing convergence.
What kind of role did automation play in his success with chocolate? Because a lot of candy at that time wasn't the way we think of it now, mass-produced. Was he one of the first to mass-produce it, or most successful at mass-producing candy?
Milton Hershey really benefited from the emergence of mass production techniques. Sometimes he's been compared to as Henry Ford of the confectionery world. The whole history of the Hershey Company and chocolate manufacturing, their chocolate manufacturing, is one of moving from handwork into what we call continuous flow production. During Milton Hershey's lifetime, steps were mechanized, but there were a lot of human intervention in between each of the steps in making milk chocolate. And their goal since his death has always been to move it towards continuous flow, which of course they have today. But he is introducing the use of conveyor belts, of large-scale batch production. They would have football field-sized rooms of what are called longitudes or conches, processing milk chocolate before it gets molded. So just the scale is enormous. One of the reasons why Milton Hershey abandons any kind of consumer advertising is that the Hershey Company so dominates the market and he just doesn't have any real competition. So there was a reason why we knew our Hershey's milk chocolate bar to be just called the Hershey bar, because there wasn't anyone really competing with him.
Well, he did some smart things, and whether it came from his personality or just his sense of being a good marketer almost innately. And I'm fast forwarding this. I do want to talk about some other things that happened around that time period. But in World War II, he supported the war effort. And one of the ways he did it was the way he knew how, and that was to provide the Allied forces with, or at least the U.S. members of the Allied forces, with Hershey chocolate bars. And that was a good way to show his support for the troops at that time in the war effort. But it was also an unbelievable marketing idea, because all of those troops would then go back home after the war, and they would have these memories of the Hershey bar that was very strong on emotion. Here's a person that supported us when we were overseas, and it becomes even more a part of America than it ever was. But that kind of stems, it seems like, almost a natural, and this goes with his philanthropy and also his management style. He had a natural feeling about people, and maybe that came through in the way he made decisions on his products.
I think that Hershey did play a very significant role during World War II, as did, many other confectionery companies. During World War II, much of confectionery production, not just for Hershey, but for all the other major confectionery manufacturers, is being diverted towards military use. In fact, we have this great essay, a student essay in the archives collection about a high school girl who wrote about unexpectedly receiving a Hershey's milk chocolate bar, and how she hadn't seen one in years, and how just her anticipation of it and it being consumed much too quickly, and keeping the wrapper so she could still smell the chocolate. So it really paints a picture of just that kind of restrictions that the home front was facing during World War II, because so much of that confectionery production is being sent to military purposes.
Did he have a sense of his brand identity over the years? Because you don't establish a brand identity as iconic as Hershey's without having a certain commitment to consistency. Did he have any kind of sense of his corporate image back then? He may not have even thought of it as a brand identity, but that what we now call as a brand identity.
I think you see it in the development of packaging. When Hershey's milk chocolate is introduced, the label design they're not consistent from product to product. So a Hershey's cocoa tin looked different than a Hershey's milk chocolate bar that looked different than a Hershey's almond bar. And a Kiss box, a Hershey's Kisses chocolate box, looked again different. And so it's not until about 1912 that begins to standardize, and the block letter design is used across all those products. But really you see it, that sensitivity to brand identity and protecting your brand, with Hershey's Kisses chocolates. They are initially introduced in 1907, and they did not have the trademark plume on them. And most of Hershey's Kisses chocolates are sold in bulk. And so it was a pretty easy product for competitors to produce knockoff products, because there could be a Hershey sign, or maybe not even sign, but Hershey so dominates the market that the Kisses are seen, you just see the shape and you assume it's a Hershey's Kiss. And you would know it was a Hershey's Kiss when you unwrap it, and there would be a little square of tissue that would have the company name on it. And so it's that kind of infringement by competitors that leads Hershey to first introduce the plume in 1921, but then to start trademarking. They go through a series of trademarks to protect the identity of the Kiss as being a Hershey product, to the point where in the year 2000, the word Kiss and chocolate are identified as being a Hershey identity.
You mentioned earlier how many products Milton Hershey had when they were caramels. When he had chocolates, even before 1900, he had 114 products, and that was in 1896. And these were all chocolate products. So that just gives you an idea of the range. Hershey bar, that was introduced early on. You mentioned Hershey's Kisses in 1907. They first put your favorite bar, the Hershey with almonds, was 1908. Mr. Good Bar, that was an interesting story, 1925. How did the name for Mr. Goodbar come about?
One of the unique things about Hershey products that are created during Milton Hershey's lifetime is that they're all solid chocolate products. And so Hershey's milk chocolate with almonds was the first to have inclusions in it. But almonds can be kind of expensive, and so peanuts was another, American favorite nut, though it's not really a nut. But they were working on the creation of a milk chocolate bar with peanut inclusions. And so they're in the lab and they're taste testing and things like that. And Milton Hershey's there. And I think this is a really true story because it's related by Sam Hinkle, who was the chemist at the time. And so he was an eyewitness. And Milton Hershey's hearing, is starting to go. He's in his late 70s. So they're tasting it, and someone says, "That's a good bar." And Milton Hershey thought that they were trying to name the bar, and so Mr. Good Bar. So that's how the bar got its name.
And was it a hot seller back then?
It was very popular, particularly during the Depression, because it was, with the inclusion of peanuts, which were a less expensive ingredient, the Mr. Good Bar during the 1930s weighed about 2 ounces, and it cost a nickel. And with all the peanuts, it upped its protein content, and so it actually was advertised as a tasty lunch.
Well, we have Milton Hershey now. He's already been a success with caramels, and now he's becoming a major success with chocolates, and he's just a leading American business person coast to coast and around the world. He's starting to sell chocolates, and his name is part of the product, and it's out there. It's a strong brand now. That would be enough for a lot of people, but one of the things we didn't talk about when we talked about him building his factory in what became Hershey, Pennsylvania, was the fact that he created Hershey, Pennsylvania. He wanted to create a model community around his plant, and this is not unusual for these captains of industry of the day. They would oftentimes have plants, and they would have plant towns right next to the factory where the workers lived. What was different about Milton Hershey when he created his community next to his plant?
When the Hershey Chocolate Company is rapidly expanding after the Lancaster Caramel Company is sold, within 2 years he needs to build a new factory. He's outgrown his space. And so he looks up and down the eastern seaboard for space and ends up deciding to come back to where he was born. Most people thought he was a little questionable in that decision making, but there were good reasons. This area of Pennsylvania is known for its dairy herds, and fresh milk was a critical ingredient. Plus, it was located on a major rail line, and there was abundant fresh water that was necessary. And I think also what really attracted Milton Hershey was the open land, because the town that he wanted to build wasn't an afterthought. The building a factory, building a town really went hand in hand. And in fact, if you look at articles that are being written in 1903 about Milton Hershey's, announcement that they're going to build a factory, the description of this model industrial town is part and parcel of the announcement. And those early descriptions, 1903, they've just broken ground for the factory. There's nothing here of the town. Really paint a picture of this almost utopian place that Milton Hershey wanted his workers and their families to be able to live in beautiful surroundings, to have access to recreation and maybe cultural events, to have quality schools for his workers' children to attend, to be able to buy your own home, that your job wouldn't be tied to your home. and so that you would have a personal investment in the community. And so those things really separate Milton Hershey from, particularly in Pennsylvania, what are known as company towns, like the coal towns or the steel towns.
It's interesting you mention that, because if you would picture a coal town, you might picture these wood frame duplexes or row houses or huts, basically, that the families would live in. Large families would live in these 2-bedroom or small places. But Milton Hershey, from what I understand, he wanted his employees to live in brick homes, standalone brick homes with manicured yards, is what I read, tree-lined streets. He wanted churches, and he wanted, as you mentioned, recreational facilities. So he had a vision. Did Hershey live up to that vision?
I think so. We have some very early plans. You know, one of the first things that he has to do is to acquire land. And so by 1903, when he breaks ground for his chocolate factory, he's acquired about 1,200 acres of land. By the time of his death in 1945, he's acquired a little over 12,000 acres of land. A lot of that is in dairy farms, but a lot of that transitions into the community. The houses here are, and the earliest houses are not always brick, but they're, 2-story frame buildings, some duplexes, many single-family homes, sidewalks everywhere, paved streets. The main street in Hershey is called Chocolate Avenue, and the main cross street is called Cocoa Avenue. He was maybe whimsical, but maybe, wanting his workers and the residents to recognize that chocolate is really an international product. So all of the residential street names are named after either countries or cocoa growing regions in the world. So, we don't have a Main Street or, a Cherry Street or a Maple Street. We have Ariba and Granada and Java and Trinidad are the street names here in Hershey.
So you get a little bit of a lesson about a history of the company just by looking at the town map.
Yes.
He met his wife, Catherine, when he was already a successful person. The two of them got married, and they never had kids. It sounds like they had this tremendous partnership, and one of the things they decided to do was start the Milton Hershey School. Actually, it wasn't called the Milton Hershey School when he started it. What was it called?
Milton and Catherine Hershey were unable to have children. We don't know why. We do know that Catherine, shortly after they were married, a few years after they were married, started showing signs of a disease that was never fully identified, but it was neurological in nature. It caused her to lose feeling in her extremities, to sometimes have trouble walking. Sometimes it would go into remission. So we only know it by its symptoms. And I don't know if that was the reason why they couldn't have children or it was something else. But that was something that was very heartbreaking to them. And it was Kitty who, they were faced with the fact that they didn't have any immediate heirs for this growing fortune. And so it was Kitty who, came up with the idea of perhaps creating a home and school for young orphan boys that might be facing a future similar to Milton Hershey's own childhood. And so they created it through a deed of trust in 1909, and initially the school is called the Hershey Industrial School.
Eventually, Catherine would die. She died around 1915, and 3 years after she died, Milton Hershey decided with all of his wealth that he would transfer it to the Hershey Trust. And the Hershey Trust continues to serve a valuable purpose in the operation of the Milton Hershey School, doesn't it?
Well, when Milton and Catherine established the school through this deed of trust, the trust fund that's created to help support the school is pretty modest. It's about 486 acres of land, farmland, and the income that could be derived from it. Catherine will die in 1915, and then, though, what I forgot to say was that when the deed of trust for the school was created, Milton Hershey also wrote his will. And the will specified that upon his death and his wife's death, his fortune would be placed in the school's trust fund. Kitty dies in 1915, and again, I wish I knew what he was thinking, but in 1918, he basically decides to enact his will. At that point, his wealth consists of the Hershey Chocolate Company, which is privately held, and he owns well over 90% of the stock. Plus, it is all of the non-chocolate businesses that Milton Hershey has established to help manage and run the town. All the land that he has acquired to support all his enterprises. And so all of that is consolidated under the umbrella of the Hershey Chocolate Company, and that asset is put into the school's trust fund. The Hershey Trust Company is the trustee. The Hershey Trust Company is also the retail bank for the community. So it's not, they have multi-functions, and actually it starts out as a community bank. It'll be several years before that responsibility is taken away from them with the establishment of the Hershey National Bank so that they can focus just on managing the school's trust fund.
It's not hard to imagine then the legacy that he would have left when you look at the involvement he had in the everyday life of all the people that lived in this part of the state, let alone all the people that are familiar with his products and loyal customers. Did he interact with the students that much? Would it be too far-fetched to say that he was a father figure for any of them?
Milton Hershey definitely was a father figure to all the boys that attended the school. When the school first is established, the parameters for enrollment in the school changed during Milton Hershey's own lifetime. He makes some changes because the school, in many ways, in those early years, is an experiment. They're trying things out and they're figuring out what's going to work best and how can they best educate these young boys. So when the school first is established, it's boys who have lost their father or both parents, and they're between the ages of 4 and 8. In 1933, he makes some significant changes to the deed of trust, and now it's boys between the ages of 4 and 15, and either parent can be deceased to be allowed for enrollment to the school. He was very much a father figure. He really enjoyed visiting the boys. The boys would come to his home once a year, particularly when they're very young, for a breakfast on his home High Point's porch, and then they would have an outing to Hershey Park, which was a really big deal. Because these boys are living in student homes. The young boys are living with sort of a matron, and then the older boys are living with house parents. But they're living on a farm, and they're being raised to do farm chores, in addition to their schooling, much as Milton Hershey did when he was a child. So Milton Hershey, in many ways, is trying to bring to their lives all the positive things about growing up on a farm that he remembered.
You've spent so much time over the years studying Milton Hershey, the Hershey family, the Hershey Company, all of its history. After a while, I would have to think that you start to feel like you know a person that you've never met. How would you describe how well you might know Milton Hershey and how he thought? I
would never presume to think what Milton Hershey might think. He was in many ways an enigma. Plus, he is a man that came of age in a totally different world than we live in today. And so, and with that, he brought his own, group of prejudices and worldviews that most people, you just wouldn't understand because that wasn't your life experience. But he definitely was someone who embraced change. He was someone who believed that the value of money was the good that it could do, and he lived that. He actually sort of posited that in an autograph book way before he ever had achieved success. And so it's one thing to, sort of write it down when you don't have the money. It's easy to say, oh, yeah, I'll give my money away. But then he lived those words once he had success. And so I think that was something that was very important to him. I think he would shake his head at a lot of things that, have happened today. But I think also he would be pleased to know that what he created not only has survived, but has succeeded and prospered.
Just to recap the company, because we really didn't talk about the company per se, but we have to say at least some of the things the company does to give this context, and that is we have the Hershey products, all the Hershey branded products, and we have the companies that Hershey has either acquired over the years or other brands. So we have, under the Hershey umbrella, we have Reese's, we have York Peppermint Patty, we have Twizzlers. In North America, we have Rolo and Cadbury brands. But with all of its broad reach in the confectionery and candy business, it still stays focused on what it does best. It still stays focused on candy, confections, and mostly North America. If he were to look at that, what do you think he would say?
I think he would be very satisfied to know that, Hershey's milk chocolate is, the number one milk chocolate product in the United States, that it is something that, most children, that will be their first experience with chocolate when they're growing up. The Reese is just a fascinating story. It's a product that Milton Hershey helped nurture. It wasn't his product, but it was a candy company that was established in Hershey, Pennsylvania. Hershey sold them the chocolate that make up a Reese's peanut butter cup, and it was acquired by the company in 1963. So that partnership, Milton Hershey always believed that unless you were a solid chocolate product, you weren't a competitor. So he was very happy to sell you coating chocolate to help, today's world that would never happen, but Hershey chocolate is being used to enrobe the Mars candy products, and it's being used to enrobe the Peter Paul, like Almond Joy and Mounds products during Milton Hershey's lifetime. So that's sort of an interesting how many different ways Hershey's chocolate found its way into other confectionery products during Milton Hershey's lifetime. That, of course, is not true today. But Hershey, I think the Hershey company is growing and evolving. They are much more than chocolate today. They have non-chocolate. They have, a whole range of what would be considered snacking kinds of products in their portfolio. So just as Milton Hershey evolved and grew his company and expanded it, you can't rest on your laurels. You always have to be growing and expanding, and trying to stay true to your culture and your values while moving forward.
Pamela Whitenack, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you. I always love to talk about Hershey, so it's always fun for me.
To learn more about all things Hershey's, please see our show notes at shapingopinion.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please let people know by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcasts. You can subscribe to the Shaping Opinion podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcasts. We'd love to hear from you. On Twitter, just tweet to us at Shaping Opinion, or you can get in touch with us through our website, shapingopinion.com. We have a Facebook group that you can join and a Facebook page you can follow. And we're on Instagram at Shaping Opinion. Shaping Opinion is a production of O'Brien Communications. This is where we talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Until next time, I'm Tim O'Brien.